Okay, the third lecture this week is about the hooliganism piece, and this one is really more of just sort of exemplifying some of the concepts that we talked about in the first couple lectures in the first handful of readings. So this one, as you may have noticed, really focused, the piece actually came out in the 80s. It was really focused on hooligans, fans of European soccer, and sort of the comparison of that hooliganism, that period of hooliganism, to sort of the bloodthirsty fans of the fall during the fall of the Roman Empire, with gladiators battling it out, fighting each other. If anyone watched the sort of Russell Crowe film Gladiator, that's what they're talking about. The hooliganism of the '80s sort of matched the cheering mob of Rome during its downfall years. They were trying to make the comparison and saying that it was sort of seemingly the demise of society. Culture was regressing. We were losing civility. Obviously, a lot's changed since the 80s. So in the 80s, sports were still very localized. So we didn't necessarily have national brands in terms of athletes or teams, or international brands the way we do now. So maybe as we get a little further into the 80s, we see something like, in the U.S. culture anyway, something like Michael Jordan becomes a national and international brand. But for the most part, sports, other than the absolute biggest of superstars, sports were very localized. So the local city, maybe the few counties around a team, or maybe a state was really following or really heavily sort of invested in a team. But fandom didn't reach really beyond that scope. So every city was sort of supportive of their team, but teams, brands, and individual athletes weren't really that well known sort of globally. Fan behaviors, as in a similar sort of fashion, were perhaps spread through reputation and maybe a little bit of media coverage. So you might have heard in newspapers or on a broadcast or two that the Philadelphia Eagles fans are really rough, or the Cleveland Brown fans are really rough. But that was basically the extent of it. There wasn't the sort of wall-to-wall coverage, social media coverage everywhere that there is now. No social media coverage in the 80s, of course. There wasn't social media. But not really that much coverage in general. ESPN wasn't sort of the all-encompassing sports coverage, analyzing everything, several channels with analysts on constantly talking about things. So anything that did happen was kept very sort of localized. And hooliganism was one of the areas in which it moved beyond a localized performance, and reputation and things like that started spreading because it was such sort of powerful events, or powerful and sometimes tragic events that happened around it. Naturally, those types of things tend to spread in terms of reputation, or just as news elements or news events. It tends to spread information faster than just sort of regular mundane sports fan activities that might have been happening in the States. So that's one area that it's really a different sort of animal today than it was in the 80s. In the 80s, largely, there wasn't really accountability for a hooligan performing perhaps horrible acts of violence against others. So that brings us to our third discussion item of the week, and I know that your second one was a bit more intense, so we're going to keep this one relatively light. How does social media and media saturation impact accountability of fans, athletes, coaches during the actual games, or the sort of the periods right before and after games? How does that impact their choices about behaviors and the consequences for their behaviors? And then second, trying to tie it in with this specific reading, could sports hooligans exist in a way that they did in the 80s European soccer leagues? Is that phenomenon that's even possible with the current social media landscape? So take a minute, add this into your discussion post for the week. There'll be one more discussion item in the next lecture, so don't submit it yet. But take a minute right now, hop over, fill out your discussion post, and then come back for the rest of the lecture. Okay, So not too much more about this piece that is really adding too much to our concepts or our theoretical discussions for the week. This is really just more of exemplifying some of the concepts that we've talked about in these first handful of lectures. So something that does hold true in general is that sports fan physical violence is the exception, and it was in the 80s when all of this research was being conducted about hooliganism. It was still the fact that sports fan violence was the exception at the time, and it certainly is now. So I'm guessing most of your discussions for the last slide are going to focus on sort of a heightened accountability, probably diminishes or acts as an inhibitor for fans that are maybe considering going down kind of a violent direction. They might think about and see others very much. The level of accountability is higher, and the consequences for doing something dumb, especially as a player or somewhere where the camera is pointed at you, but also the fans as well. It probably inhibits them from performing physical violence. So even more so perhaps today, physical violence is very much the exception and not the rule. But with that being said, threats, psychological abuse, social or relational aggression are certainly still prevalent and often fly under the radar. So what somebody says in passing at maybe a tailgate or fans leaving the arena from one fan group to another fan group, it's very unlikely that there'd be consequences for that for the person who is doing the aggressing. So those are certainly still in play, and they shouldn't be forgotten. So even though physical violence is maybe very, very rare, it's likely that threats, physical abuse, other types of aggression are still very much prevalent. One thing that did come out of the piece that I thought was interesting in terms of applying our identity theoretical framework is kind of a description of typical hooligans. Male, under 25 years old, lower socioeconomic status. In the 80s, hooliganism was very much white male, under 25, lower SES. So when we have that in place, that maybe gives us a bit of an understanding about how identity might be working in terms of these hooligans. So if we want to think of places where in someone's ego or someone's identity gets a boost and where someone's identity gets sort of a ding, if we think about young, lower class males, they probably have a lot of areas of threatened identity. So we have lower socioeconomic status usually brings in a number of things. So lower education, lower income, lower job status, lower just sort of personal wealth or personal finances. So there's a lot of sort of the economic indicator hardships for these individuals. So in all of those areas, they receive sort of a ding on their identity. And the research shows that they need to affirm or possibly affirm their masculine identities through sports and through especially sports violence if you're looking at hooligans. So this is an area where they're maybe perhaps trying to account for or make up the difference for all of the other areas of their life where their identity is so lowered based on just sort of our culture and society. They have such a lowered or threatened sense of identity that they need to overplay this sports and sports violence identity to boost up their own masculinity. Now, I'm not trying to present this as some way to solve the problem, because certainly there's still going to be issues of socioeconomic status, education, jobs, finances, all sorts of things like that that will always play into it. So it isn't necessarily presenting a solution, but it is perhaps a way of thinking about this problem and understanding sort of, okay, that makes sense now, that these people would be seeking out this sort of hyper-masculine identity in sports and sports violence, sports fan violence, because their identity is suffering in so many other areas. All right, and that's it for Lecture 3.